The autumn rain fell in heavy sheets across the village of Thornmere, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud that swallowed the feet of anyone foolish enough to venture outside without proper boots. But Elspeth had no proper boots, only worn cloth wrappings that did little to keep the cold wetness from seeping into her bones as she made her way to the baker's shop, her wooden cart creaking behind her laden with the morning's bread she had prepared in her own small oven. The villagers who saw her coming would step aside, not out of courtesy, but to avoid being splashed by the mud, her considerable weight displaced with each laboured step. She heard their whispers, sharp as winter wind, cutting through the sound of the rain. "There goes the widow," one woman muttered to her companion, loud enough for Elspeth to hear. 3 years since her husband died, and she's grown even larger. No man would have her now, not even for her baking. "They say she eats half the bread she makes," another voice added with a cruel laugh. "Unfit to wed, that one. Unfit for anything but kneading dough." Elspeth kept her eyes forward, her round face impassive despite the familiar sting of their words. She had learned long ago that showing pain only encouraged more cruelty, so she wore her dignity like armour, though it was armour full of holes. Her husband, Thomas, had been a kind man, a carpenter whose hands could shape wood into beauty, and he had loved her when she was young and slender, loved her still as the years and childbearing had changed her body, loved her until the fever took him and left her alone, with 2 young daughters to feed. The weight had come after his death, grief and worry manifesting as flesh, each pound a testament to sleepless nights and meals eaten mechanically while her mind wandered through memories of better days. She delivered her bread to the baker, who paid her a pittance, but at least paid her consistently, and then made her way to the market square, where she would sell the remaining loaves directly. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, and the square was beginning to fill with the usual morning crowd. Elspeth set up her small stall in the corner, the worst position, the one no other merchant wanted because it was farthest from the main thoroughfare and closest to the drainage ditch that often overflowed. But it was all she could afford, and she arranged her bread with careful precision, each loaf positioned to show its golden crust to best advantage. "Fresh bread," she called out, her voice strong despite her exhaustion. "Honey, wheat and rye, baked this morning before dawn." A few customers approached, drawn by the quality of her goods, if not by the quality of their maker. She had learned her craft from her mother, who had learned it from her mother before her, and there was magic in her hands when it came to flour and water and yeast, a magic that transformed simple ingredients into something that brought comfort and sustenance. As she made her sales, counting out the small copper coins with practiced efficiency, she noticed a commotion at the far end of the square. Riders were entering Thornmere, not the usual travellers or merchants, but soldiers in the king's livery, their horses magnificent beasts that pranced and snorted in the morning mist. The villagers gathered to stare, and whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd. The king's men rarely came to Thornmere, which was too small and insignificant to warrant royal attention under normal circumstances. Elspeth watched with mild curiosity, but she did not leave her stall. She had bread to sell, and curiosity did not fill empty stomachs or pay for the flour she would need for tomorrow's baking. The captain of the guard, a tall man with a scar across his left cheek that spoke of battles survived, dismounted and began to speak with the village elder, old Garrett, who looked flustered and nervous at this unexpected attention. Their conversation was too distant for Elspeth to hear, but she could see Garrett gesturing wildly, pointing in various directions, and then, to her surprise, pointing directly at her. The captain's gaze followed the gesture, and his eyes met hers across the crowded square. She felt a flutter of unease in her stomach, wondering what business the king's men could possibly have with a poor widow who sold bread in the corner of the market. The captain began walking toward her, his boots splashing through puddles, with the confident stride of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The crowd parted before him like water before the prow of a ship, and Elspeth found herself straightening her spine, lifting her chin, refusing to cower, even though every instinct told her that attention from the powerful was rarely good fortune for the powerless. He stopped before her stall, his eyes scanning the loaves of bread, and then he looked at her face, really looked at her, in a way that most people in Thornmere had stopped doing years ago. "You are Elspeth, widow of Thomas the carpenter?" he asked, his voice formal but not unkind. "I am," she replied, her hands folding in front of her apron, a gesture of calm she did not truly feel. "I am Captain Aldrich, in service to King Edmund III, he said, and she noticed that he did not use the dismissive tone that others often employed when speaking to her. "His Majesty has sent me on a task that has brought me to your village, and I have been told that you are a woman of certain qualities that interest the crown." Elspeth's mind raced, trying to understand what this could mean. She had done nothing to attract royal attention, paid her taxes such as they were, kept to herself, raised her daughters as best she could. "I am but a baker, sir," she said carefully. "I know nothing of matters that would interest a king." "Nevertheless," Captain Aldrich continued, "I must ask you to accompany me to the capital. The king wishes to meet you." The market square had gone silent, every ear straining to hear this extraordinary exchange. Elspeth felt the weight of their stares, felt the shock and disbelief radiating from the villagers who had mocked her only moments before. "I have daughters," she said, her first thought for her children. "I cannot simply leave them." "They will be provided for and may accompany you if you wish," the captain said. "The king's command is not a request that can be refused, but I assure you, no harm is intended. You have my word as a knight of the realm." There was something in his eyes, a sincerity that made Elspeth believe him, though she could not fathom what possible reason King Edmund could have for summoning her. She thought of her daughters, Mara, who was 9, and had her father's gentle eyes, and Lily, who was 7, and had her mother's stubborn determination. She thought of the small cottage where they lived, the garden where she grew herbs for her baking, the life she had built from the ruins of her grief. And then she thought of the whispers, the mockery, the daily humiliation of being invisible except when she was being scorned. And something shifted inside her chest, a small spark of defiance. "Very well," she said, "I will come, and my daughters with me. Give me time to make arrangements." The captain nodded, a slight smile touching his stern features. "We leave at midday. My men will help you prepare." The journey to the capital took 3 days, and they were 3 days unlike any Elspeth had ever known. She and her daughters rode in a covered wagon, protected from the elements, and the soldiers treated them with respect that bordered on deference, a stark contrast to the treatment she was accustomed to in Thornmere. Captain Aldrich rode alongside the wagon for much of the journey, and in the evenings when they made camp, he would sit by their fire and tell stories of the kingdom, of the king, of the court, and its intrigue. Elspeth listened carefully, trying to glean some understanding of why she had been summoned, but the captain either did not know or would not say. "The king is a good man," Aldrich told her on the second evening, as they sat watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "He lost his queen 2 years ago to a wasting sickness, and the grief nearly destroyed him. He has been under great pressure to remarry, to produce an heir, but he has refused every noble lady presented to him. The court whispers that he has lost his mind with sorrow." "And what has this to do with me?" Elspeth asked, though a strange suspicion was beginning to form in her mind, too absurd to voice aloud. Aldrich looked at her, his scarred face thoughtful in the firelight. "His Majesty has his own counsel, and I am but his servant. But I will tell you this, you should not underestimate your own worth, regardless of what others may have led you to believe." Boo! The capital city of Aldermere rose before them on the morning of the 4th day, its walls towering and ancient, its spires reaching toward heaven like stone prayers. Elspeth had never seen anything so magnificent, so overwhelming in its scale and grandeur. The city teemed with life. Merchants and nobles and beggars and soldiers all crowded together in a chaos that made Thornmere's market square seem like a quiet garden. The wagon rolled through the streets, climbing toward the castle that dominated the highest hill, and Elspeth felt her heart hammering in her chest, her daughters clinging to her arms with wide, frightened eyes. The castle gates opened to admit them, and they entered a courtyard so vast that Elspeth could scarcely believe one family could live in such a place. Servants rushed forward to help them from the wagon, and a woman in fine silks, the royal steward, if Elspeth understood correctly, came to greet them with a curtsy that seemed entirely inappropriate for someone of Elspeth's station. "My lady," the steward said, and Elspeth nearly laughed at the title. "His Majesty requests your presence in the great hall. Your daughters will be taken to comfortable quarters and cared for until you return." "I would prefer they stay with me," Elspeth said, her protective instincts flaring. "They will be safe, I swear it," the steward assured her. "And you will be reunited with them shortly. The king wishes to speak with you privately first." With great reluctance, Elspeth kissed her daughters and allowed herself to be led away, through corridors hung with tapestries depicting battles and coronations, past rooms filled with treasures she could barely comprehend. Finally, they reached a great oak door, and the steward knocked once before pushing it open. "The widow Elspeth of Thornmere, Your Majesty," she announced, and then stepped aside. Elspeth entered the great hall, her worn shoes silent on the polished stone floor. The hall was enormous, with vaulted ceilings that disappeared into shadow and windows that let in shafts of coloured light through stained glass depicting saints and angels. But Elspeth's attention was drawn immediately to the man standing before the massive fireplace at the far end of the hall. He was not old, perhaps 35, with dark hair beginning to show threads of silver at the temples and a face that bore the marks of care and sorrow. He wore fine clothes but no crown, and his eyes, when they met hers, were the eyes of a man who had looked into the abyss of loss and barely climbed back out. "Come forward," King Edmund said, his voice quiet but carrying easily in the vast space. "Do not be afraid." Elspeth walked toward him, her legs trembling but her head high, and she stopped at a respectful distance, curtsying as best she could with her stiff knees and aching back. "Your Majesty," she said, "I am honored, though I confess I do not understand why I'm here." The king studied her for a long moment, his gaze traveling over her face, her body, her worn clothing, and she braced herself for the judgment she was so accustomed to receiving. But what she saw in his eyes was not disgust or mockery. It was something else, something that looked almost like recognition, as if he saw in her something that others had missed. "I have a story to tell you," the king said, gesturing to the chairs near the fire. "Will you sit with me?" They sat, and King Edmund began to speak, his words painting a picture of love and loss that made Elspeth's heart ache with recognition. He spoke of his wife, Queen Catherine, who had been beautiful and kind and beloved by the kingdom. He spoke of how they had loved each other since childhood, how their marriage had been not just a political alliance, but a true partnership of hearts. And he spoke of how she had died, slowly and painfully, her body wasting away while her spirit remained strong until the very end. "Before she died," the king said, his voice rough with emotion, "Catherine made me promise something. She knew the court would pressure me to remarry, to produce an heir, to treat marriage as merely a matter of state. She made me promise that if I ever did remarry, it would be for the right reasons, that I would choose someone who understood what it meant to love and to lose, someone who had known hardship and survived it with grace, someone whose worth was measured not by appearance or status, but by the strength of their character." Elspeth felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, understanding beginning to dawn, like sunrise after the longest night. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "I am no one. I am a baker's widow, fat and plain and mocked by my own village. Why would you—" "I sent scouts throughout my kingdom," Edmund interrupted gently, with instructions to find women who fit Catherine's description. Not noble women or beauties, but women who had endured, who had persevered, who had maintained their dignity in the face of cruelty and hardship. Your name was brought to me by a traveling merchant who had passed through Thornmere and tasted your bread. He spoke of how you provided for your daughters alone, how you worked before dawn and late into the night, how you bore mockery with quiet strength, how you gave bread to those who could not pay, how you had not let grief destroy you, even when it would have been easier to simply give up. I did what any mother would do, Elspeth said, her voice shaking. No, the king said firmly. You did what a woman of exceptional character would do. I have met dozens of noble ladies in the past 2 years, all of them eager to be queen, none of them seeing me as anything more than a crown and a throne. But you did not seek this. You did not even imagine it was possible, and that is precisely why I believe you may be the one Catherine hoped I would find. Elspeth could not speak. The enormity of what he was suggesting crashed over her like a wave, threatening to sweep her away. I am not fit to be a queen, she finally managed. Who decides what is fitting? Edmund asked, leaning forward in his chair. The nobles, who value nothing but bloodlines and alliances. The courtiers who care only for appearance and fashion. I am the king, and I decide what I value in a queen. I need someone who understands the lives of common people, who has known hunger and fear and the struggle to survive. I need someone who can be a true partner, not just an ornament. I need someone real. I am very real, Elspeth said, a hint of her old humor breaking through despite everything. Perhaps too real, too solid, too much flesh and too little grace. For the first time the king smiled, and it transformed his face, driving away some of the shadows that haunted his eyes. My kingdom needs a queen who is strong enough to bear not just the crown, but the weight of true responsibility. Your body reflects your strength, not your weakness. You have carried burdens that would have crushed others. You have fed your children and built a life from nothing. That is the kind of strength I need beside me. They talked for hours, the king and the widow, two people who had loved and lost, who had been broken and had found ways to mend themselves. Edmund told her of the pressures he faced, the nobles who sought to manipulate him, the constant threat of war from neighboring kingdoms, the responsibility of ruling over hundreds of thousands of lives. Elspeth told him of her life in Thornmere, the daily struggle, the small joys she found in her daughter's laughter and the warmth of fresh bread, the pain of being seen as less than human by those who judged only by appearance. As the sun moved across the sky and the colored light from the windows shifted from blue to gold to red, Elspeth felt something she had not felt in years: hope. Not hope for rescue or salvation, because she had learned to save herself, but hope for connection, for understanding, for the possibility that life might hold more than mere survival. I cannot promise you love, Edmund said as the afternoon waned. I loved Catherine with all my heart, and that love died with her, but I can promise you respect, partnership, and genuine affection. I can promise that I will never mock you or diminish you, that I will value your counsel and your perspective, that I will be a father to your daughters and protect them as my own. And what do you ask of me in return? Elspeth asked. Be yourself, he said simply. Be honest with me. Help me rule with wisdom and compassion. Be the queen that Catherine believed this kingdom needed, the queen who understands the lives of those we serve. Elspeth thought of her daughters, of the life she could give them as stepdaughters of the king, educated and protected and free from the poverty and scorn that had shadowed their early years. She thought of the example she could set, showing that worth was not measured in physical beauty or noble birth, that a woman who had been dismissed and denigrated could rise to the highest position in the land. And she thought of Edmund himself, This man, who had been brave enough to reject convention, to honor his dead wife's wisdom, to see value where others saw only something to mock. "I will need time," she said carefully. "This is not a decision to be made lightly, not for you and certainly not for me. The court will be scandalized. The nobles will rebel. I have no training in statecraft, no understanding of the intricacies of rule." "You will have all the time you need," Edmund said. "Stay in the castle as my guest. Learn about the court. See if you can imagine yourself in this role. I will not pressure you, nor will I allow anyone else to do so. The decision must be yours, made freely." And so Elspeth stayed, and the weeks that followed were a revelation. She was given quarters in the royal wing, rooms more luxurious than she had ever imagined, and her daughters thrived in the castle, making friends with the children of nobles and servants alike, taking lessons from the royal tutors, their faces bright with happiness that made Elspeth's heart swell with gratitude. She met with the king daily, sometimes formally in council meetings where she observed the business of governance, sometimes informally over meals where they simply talked as two people learning to know each other. The court was indeed scandalized. Elspeth heard the whispers, saw the shocked faces, felt the weight of disapproval from nobles who could not comprehend why their king would consider marrying a common widow, and a fat one at that. But she also saw something else. She saw the servants who smiled at her with genuine warmth, who appreciated that she learned their names and asked after their families. She saw the common people who came to the castle with petitions and grievances, who found in her someone who understood their struggles in a way no queen before her ever had. And she saw Edmund watching her with growing respect and affection as she proved herself to be thoughtful, intelligent, and possessed of a natural wisdom that came from living close to the realities of life. Lady Marguerite, one of the most powerful noblewomen at court, confronted Elspeth one day in the garden where she had gone to find a moment of peace among the roses. "You do not belong here," Marguerite said coldly, her beautiful face twisted with disdain. "You are an embarrassment to the crown, to the kingdom. How dare you presume to take the place that should belong to someone of noble blood?" Elspeth looked at the lady, at her perfect face and perfect figure and perfect contempt, and felt not anger, but pity. "I presume nothing," she said quietly. "I was summoned here by the king, and I remain at his request. If I become queen, it will be because he has chosen me, not because I sought the position. And I will tell you something, Lady Marguerite. I know what it is to be hungry, to be cold, to wonder if I can feed my children tomorrow. I know what it is to work until my hands bleed, to be mocked and dismissed and treated as if I have no value. If I become queen, I will never forget those things, and I will use whatever power I have to ease the suffering of others who know what I have known. Can you say the same?" Marguerite had no answer, and she swept away in a rustle of silk, leaving Elspeth alone among the roses. But others had heard the exchange, and word spread through the castle of the widow, who had faced down the proud noble with quiet dignity, and slowly, very slowly, the tide of opinion began to turn. 2 months after her arrival at the castle, Elspeth sat with Edmund in the royal library, surrounded by books and scrolls that held the accumulated wisdom of centuries. They had just finished a long discussion about the kingdom's grain supply and how to ensure that no village went hungry during the coming winter, a discussion in which Elspeth's practical knowledge had proven invaluable. Edmund looked at her across the table covered in maps and ledgers, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "I know my answer," she said before he could speak. "If you still wish it, I will marry you. I will be your queen, not because I seek power or prestige, but because I believe I can do some good. I believe that together we can be stronger than either of us alone. I believe that Catherine was wise to see that the kingdom needs a different kind of queen, and I will honor her memory by being the best queen I can be." Edmund stood and came around the table, and he took her hands in his grip firm and warm. "You have already proven yourself beyond anything I dared hope for," he said. "You will not just be my queen. You will be my partner, my friend, my counselor, and who knows, perhaps in time we may find that love can grow again, different from what we knew before, but no less real." The wedding was announced, and the kingdom erupted in confusion and gossip and scandal. The nobles protested loudly, some threatening to withdraw their support from the crown. The common people, however, reacted differently. Word had spread of the widow from Thornmere, of her kindness and practical wisdom, of how she had risen from poverty and loss to stand beside the king. They saw in her a reflection of their own lives, proof that merit could triumph over birth, that worth was not determined by appearance or status. When Elspeth travelled through the capital in the weeks before the wedding, visiting markets and hospitals and orphanages, the common people lined the streets to cheer for her, and she wept at their acceptance, at the love that flowed from those who understood what it meant to struggle and survive. The wedding itself was a grand affair, held in the cathedral with all the ceremony due a royal marriage. Elspeth wore a gown specially made for her, in deep burgundy silk that flowed around her form without trying to hide or diminish it, embroidered with golden thread in patterns of wheat and bread, symbols of sustenance and life. Her daughters stood with her, dressed as princesses, their faces shining with pride and joy. And when she walked down the aisle toward where Edmund waited, she did not walk with shame or hesitation. She walked with her head high, her shoulders back, her steps firm and steady, because she knew now what she had always been, but had been taught to doubt. She was worthy, she was strong, she was enough. Edmund smiled as she reached him, a genuine smile of welcome and respect, and when he took her hands, she felt the connection between them. Not romantic love, not yet, but something solid and real nonetheless. The bishop spoke the ancient words, binding them together before God and kingdom, and when Edmund placed the crown upon her head, Elspeth felt the weight of it, the responsibility, the power, and the purpose. "Queen Elspeth," the bishop announced, and the cathedral erupted in cheers from the common people who had been allowed to fill the back pews, their voices drowning out the polite applause of the nobles in the front. The months that followed were not easy. Elspeth faced opposition and resentment from those who believed she had no right to the throne. She made mistakes, missteps born of inexperience with courtly protocol and political maneuvering, but she also made changes, real and lasting changes, that improved the lives of the kingdom's poorest subjects. She established programs to ensure that widows and orphans were cared for, that no child went hungry, that skills like baking and carpentry were taught to those who needed trades. She sat in judgment on cases involving common people and rendered decisions that were fair and merciful, earning a reputation for justice that even the nobles grudgingly came to respect. And slowly, very slowly, she and Edmund grew closer. They were partners first, working side by side to rule the kingdom, making decisions together, trusting each other's judgment. They were friends, sharing meals and conversations, learning each other's stories, finding comfort in companionship. And then, perhaps a year after their marriage, as they stood together on a balcony overlooking the city at sunset, Edmund took her hand and said, "I think Catherine would be pleased. Catherine would be..." I think she knew that the heart can heal, that love can come in different forms, that sometimes the greatest blessings come from the most unexpected places. Elspeth looked at him, at this man who had seen past her appearance to her worth, who had given her not just a crown, but a purpose, and she felt her own heart opening carefully, tentatively, but undeniably. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she said, surprised by her own honesty. "I know I'm falling in love with you," Edmund replied, and he kissed her there on the balcony as the sun set over the kingdom they ruled together, two broken people who had found a way to be whole. Years passed, And Queen Elspeth became beloved throughout the land, known as the People's Queen, the queen who understood struggle and hardship, who used her power to lift others up rather than to exalt herself. Her daughters grew into remarkable young women, educated and compassionate, who would themselves make excellent marriages to men who valued them for their character rather than their bloodlines. And Elspeth herself, the woman who had been mocked as unfit to wed, who had been dismissed and denigrated and treated as worthless, proved that true worth comes from within, that strength takes many forms, that beauty is found in kindness and courage and perseverance. The village of Thornmere, when Elspeth returned for a visit 5 years after becoming queen, barely recognized her, not because she had changed physically, she was still the same substantial woman she had always been, but because she carried herself with confidence and grace, surrounded by royal guards and courtiers, radiating authority and compassion in equal measure. The villagers who had mocked her stood in stunned silence as she distributed gifts to the poor, funded repairs to the village well, and established a school where children could learn to read and cipher, regardless of their parents' ability to pay. And when old Garrett, the village elder, stammered out an apology for how she had been treated, Elspeth smiled and said, "I forgive you, because the woman I was needed the trials you put me through to become the woman I am now. But learn from this. Never judge a person's worth by their appearance or station. You never know when the one you mock might rise to heights you cannot imagine, and more importantly, every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of whether they ever rise at all." She returned to the capital with Edmund beside her, their hands clasped, their partnership stronger than ever, proof that love and respect could build a foundation more solid than passion alone, that two wounded souls could heal together, that unconventional choices could lead to the most profound happiness. Queen Elspeth ruled for many years, and when she finally passed away, an old woman surrounded by children and grandchildren and a kingdom that mourned her loss, she left behind a legacy that transformed the realm. She had shown that worth was not determined by birth or beauty, that strength came in many forms, that the best leaders were those who had known suffering and chose compassion anyway. The crown she wore had been heavy, but she had borne it with grace, and in doing so, she had proved what she had always known deep in her heart, but what the world had tried to make her forget, that she was enough, exactly as she was, and that being enough was everything. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Medieval Stories for more inspiring tales from history and legend. Leave a comment below telling us what you think makes someone truly worthy of respect and love, regardless of how the world judges them. Your thoughts and engagement help us continue bringing these powerful stories to life. Thank you for listening, and may you always remember your own worth, no matter what others may say.